Red Chinese who were fighting the so-called UN police action under our own General MacArthur, who by orders of the UN was fired by the pusillanimous Truman in order to prevent his winning that war, our people still believed in the UN, despite our 150,000 sons who were murdered and maimed in that war. The people continued to regard the UN as a sure means for peace, even after it was revealed in 1951 that the UN, using our own American soldiers under UN command and the UN flag, in collusion with our traitorous State Department and the Pentagon, had been invading many small cities in California and Texas.
That sounds familiar.
In order to perfect their plan for the complete takeover of our country.
Is that last year
Most
in
of
California?
our people brushed it off and continued their belief
Brushed it
that the
off.
UN is a holy of holies.
Holy of holies.
Do you know that the UN Charter was written by traitor Alger Hiss, Molotov, and Beshinsky?
Communism.
That Hiss and Molotov had made that secret agreement that the military chief of the UN was always to be a Russian appointed by Moscow? Do you know that at their secret meetings at Yalta, Roosevelt and Stalin, at the behest of the Illuminati operating as the CFR, decided that the UN must be placed on American soil? Do you know that most of the UN Charter was copied intact, word for word, from the Marx Manifesto and Russia's so-called Constitution?
I need to make.
Do you know that the only two senators who voted against the UN so-called treaty were the only two senators who had read it? Do you know that since the UN
In the microwave
was
for 2
founded,
minutes.
communist enslavement has grown from 250 million to 1 billion? Do you know that since the UN was founded to ensure peace, there have been at least 20 major wars incited
Tell
by
Pastor
the UN,
Daniel that, Clayton.
just as they are now inciting a war against Little Rhodesia? Do you know that under the UN setup, the American taxpayers have been forced to make up the UN Treasury deficit of many millions of dollars because of Russia's refusal to pay her share? Do you know that the UN has never passed a resolution condemning Russia or her so-called satellites, but always condemns our allies? Do you know that J. Edgar Hoover said, "The overwhelming majority of the communist delegations to the UN are espionage agents"? And now, 66 senators voted for a consular treaty to open our entire country to Russian spies and saboteurs. Do you know that the UN helps Russia's conquest of the world by preventing the free world from taking any action whatsoever except to debate each new aggression in the UN General Assembly? Do you know that at the time of the Korean War, there were 60 nations in the UN, yet 95% of the UN forces were our American sons, and practically 100% of the cost was paid by the United States taxpayers? And surely you know that the UN policy during the Korean War was to prevent us from winning that war. Do you know that all the battle plans of General MacArthur had to go first to the UN to be relayed to Vasilia, commander of the North Koreans and Red Chinese, and that any future wars fought by our sons under the UN flag would have to be fought under the control of the UN Security Council? Do you know that the UN has never done anything about the 80,000 Russian Mongolian troops that occupy Hungary? Where was the UN when the Hungarian freedom fighters were slaughtered by the Russians? Do you know that the UN and its peace army turned the Congo over to the communists? Do you know that the UN's own so-called peace force was used to crush, rape, and kill the white anti-communists in Do you know that the UN stood by and did nothing while Red China invaded Laos and Vietnam, that it did nothing while Nehru invaded Goa and other Portuguese territories? Do you know that the UN was directly responsible for aiding Castro? That it does absolutely nothing about the many thousands of Cuban youngsters who are shipped to Russia for communist indoctrination? Do you know that Adlai Stevenson, of all people, said the free world must expect to lose more and more decisions in the UN? Do you know that the UN openly proclaims that its chief objective is one world government, which means one world laws,
Did you put
one
2 in there?
world court,
Yeah, it's cooking.
one world army,
Here,
one
here.
world navy, one world
No,
air,
no UN,
one world
please.
school,
No,
and a
you.
one
No, we
world
need.
church in which Christianity
USA.
will be prohibited. Do you know that a UN law has been passed to disarm all American citizens and to transfer all our armed forces to the UN?
That's the part that rattles my
Such
cage.
a law was secretly signed
Secretly
by Saint
signed.
Jack Kennedy in 1961.
I believe that's the one that got
Do
shot.
you realize how that fits in with Article 47, Paragraph 3 of the UN Charter, which states, I quote, "The Military Staff Committee of the UN shall be responsible through the Security Council for the strategic direction of all armed forces placed at the disposal of the Security Council," unquote. And when and if all our armed forces are transferred to the UN, your sons would be forced to serve and die under UN command all over the world. This will happen unless you fight to get the U.S. out of the UN. Do you know that Congressman James B. Utt has submitted a bill to get the U.S. out of the UN and a resolution to prevent our president from forcing us to support the UN embargoes on Rhodesia? Well, he has, and many people all over the country are writing to their representatives to support the Utt bill and resolution. And did you know that to offset the Utt bill and resolution, 50 congressmen, spearheaded by Schweiker and Moorhead of Pennsylvania, have introduced a bill to immediately transfer all our armed forces to the UN? Can you imagine such brazen treason?
Can you imagine?
Is your congressman one of those 50 traitors? Find out and take immediate action against him and help Congressman Utt. Now, do you know that the National Council of Churches passed a
This is the
resolution in
best one.
San Francisco which states that the United States will soon have to subordinate its will to that of the UN?
Do you want that,
That
people?
all American citizens must be prepared to accept it.
Accepted.
Is your church a member of the National Council of Churches? In connection with that, bear in mind that God is never mentioned in the UN Charter, and their meetings are never opened with prayer. The creators of the UN stipulated in advance that there should be no mention of God or Jesus Christ in the UN Charter or in its UN headquarters. Does your pastor subscribe to that? Find out. Furthermore, do you know that the great majority of the so-called nations in the UN are anti-Christianity? That
Anti-Christianity.
the UN is a completely godless organization by orders of its creators, the CFR Illuminati.
Illuminati.
Now, have you heard enough of the truth about the Illuminati's United Nations?
Have
Do
you
you
heard
want to
enough?
leave your sons and our precious country to the unholy mercy
People,
of the
you gotta
Illuminati's
wake up.
United Nations? If you don't,
Oh,
Right.
don't worry.
telegraph
There's a bunch
or
of Americans heading to
phone your
Chicago for the
representatives
UN
and
buggers.
senators that they must
This
support
is war,
Congressman
people.
Utt's bill
This is war
to
against
get
our
the U.S. out
Constitution.
of the UN
You
and
do
the
not
UN
do
out of
nothing.
the
Your
U.S.
children will be communists.
Do it today.
We all
now,
will be communists.
before you forget,
If
it
it's
is the
not too
only
late already,
salvation for your sons
do something.
and for our country.